Dieting's gone wild, it's Lightening Force on SEGAiden. The second launch title for SEGA Ages on Switch takes us into exciting new territory for the publisher and its fans, the world of Technosoft. SEGA acquired the rights to developer Technosoft's library a few years ago, and with SEGA Ages Lightening Force, they've finally begun the process of integrating that third-party content into the SEGA family proper. As usual, M2 have done a bang-up job with Lightening Force, offering a highly faithful rendition of the Genesis shooter, along with a passel of options that makes it much friendlier to novice players, and less constrained by the limits of 16-bit hardware. Lightening Force is regarded by many fans as the single greatest shooter on a console renowned for its great shooters, so this Ages launch is a pretty significant moment for the SEGA faithful. Lightening Force is, of course, the oddly named fourth entry in the Thunder Force franchise. Thunder Force began on Japanese PCs and ended on PlayStation 2, but the series is synonymous for most people with Genesis. A Genesis port of Thunder Force 2 was an early release for the system, it even shipped alongside the console's launch in Europe, and it was followed by Lightening Force and Thunder Force 3 before that. And the arcade update of Thunder Force 3, Thunder Force AC, will be hitting Switch sometime in the next few months too. According to a SEGA representative, Lightening Force's prompt appearance on Switch was something of a necessity. It was announced in 2016 that Technosoft titles would be migrated to SEGA, they tell me, and ever since Sega 3D Fukoku Archives 3 was released, a Japan-exclusive Sega Classics compilation for 3DS, there hasn't been much movement. I felt it was necessary to tackle this first. Out of the three titles on Mega Drive, Lightening Force is the most polished. In that sense, I had no objection to releasing it first. Indeed, Lightening Force pushed the Genesis console to its limits. It's a fast, frantic shooter that fills the screen with enemies and projectiles, even as it pulls off a number of slick visual effects. It's the kind of game that Genesis fans could show to their Nintendo-owning friends to say, "Look how incredible this console is." By comparison, the shooters that appeared on Super NES tended to move pokily, suffer from slowdown, or sacrifice the console's trademark visual panache in order to achieve a reasonable degree of speed. Over on Super NES Works, the only zippy scrolling shooter we've seen so far has been DARIUS Twin, and that had all the graphical finesse of an early PC Engine shooter. Meanwhile, Lightening Force is like, what if every single space on the screen were filled with projectiles, and also included lots of complex layering effects and parallax depth of field? This wasn't just Technosoft showing off either. One of the game's more manic stages involves gun emplacements in the forward and rear planes of motion, outside the player's range of movement, tracking the player's movement with targeting reticles before launching salvos of projectiles that break across the visual stage. Shooters like to throw hazards at you from all 360 degrees of the screen, but Lightening Force goes the extra step by attacking across the Z-axis. It's a pretty thrilling and unexpected threat in a game that predates the genre's move into actual 3D by several years. There's a lot to love about Lightening Force. It hails from a series whose trademark was free-scrolling movement. Technosoft also gave us the proto-RTS Herzog II, and Thunder Force 2 in particular feels almost like a dry run for that game. The early entries of the Thunder Force series included some top-down stages with all-range movement, reminiscent of Broderbund's Raid on Bungling Bay, another proto-RTS. By the time Lightening Force arrived, those elements had been ironed out of the format in favor of more standardized side-scrolling. Lightening Force doesn't completely abandon its predecessor's free movement elements, though. While the game plays out almost entirely through forced forward scrolling with a few predefined mandatory shifts along the vertical axis, you still have freedom to nudge the viewpoint up and down to interact with the battlefield beyond what appears on screen. This mechanic appears in shooters from time to time, but it's hard to do well. And when done poorly, it just means you can die more easily to hazards whose presence was never broadcast. Here, though, it allows you to make different tactical decisions in order to deal with a given situation. On the desert planet, for example, formations of gliders tend to appear in the upper reaches. These pose a minor threat, dropping a handful of bombs you need to avoid, but they're unobtrusive for the most part. Instead, it's more of a score-chasing opportunity. Do you want to rack up extra points by taking out an entire glider formation? Or is it wiser to deal with the more dynamic enemy formations below? Elsewhere, an enemy tank creeps in along the very lowest portion of the screen where it's easily overlooked, but it sends up formations of smaller vessels every few seconds, and will continue doing so until you destroy it. So unless you take the time to roam outside the comfortable middle zone of the screen, you'll become stuck in a loop of taking out these enemies from below. The game's structure reflects the open philosophy of design. Unlike standard shooters, which kick off in one stage and end once you've beaten everything in sequence, Lightening Force allows you to define the order in which you'll tackle the first 4 levels. There's probably more to the game after this, but I'm very unpracticed with Lightening Force. I can't quite seem to beat the boss at the end of the desert stage, which gets to my one real complaint about Lightening Force. Unfortunately, Lightning Force does not go out of its way to give you hit notifications when you attack enemies. Bosses tend to be extremely large and present a considerable spread of potential targets, but their weak points don't really provide any clues, visual or audio, to inform you that you're landing damage against them. This isn't really a problem once you learn the patterns of the game, but it does turn your first experience into a frustrating sort of guessing game. I found myself launching attacks blindly and crossing my fingers that I was hitting the bad guys where it hurt. Still, that's a fairly mild criticism. There is a lot to like about Lightning Force. Every stage has its own personality, with dazzling environmental effects creating a sort of additional challenge as you weave behind cloud formations or try not to let a planet-sized haboob distract you from desert foes. Enemies are equally varied too. But best of all might be Lightning Force's core weapon mechanics. Yeah, you can gain upgrades as you play, ranging from energy blades to smart projectiles that chase enemies, but unlike in other shooters, you don't have to stick to one weapon type. Instead, you can toggle freely between any of the weapons currently in your possession. By default, you begin with 2 options, a forward-facing spread and a rear gun. The more guns you acquire, the more capable you can take on the bad guys. Being able to switch weapons on the fly gives you a lot of versatility, allowing you more freedom in how you deal with threats than you see in shooters where you only have a fixed weapon and have more trouble dealing with bad guys approaching from inconvenient angles. You can also adjust your speed on the fly, allowing you to move precisely in tight situations or to streak across the screen when facing off against fast-moving foes. There's a lot of player agency here that you don't see in other shooters, and it counts for a lot. Of course, you lose all but your default weapons when you die, unless that is, you make use of the Kids mode M2 added for SEGA Ages. Kids mode makes 2 critical changes to the fundamental design of Lightning Force that makes the game much easier, if still not quite a cakewalk. First, enemies in Kids mode take only half the normal number of hits to kill. Honestly, the base difficulty tends to rely on bullet sponges, so in my opinion this is a reasonable change that makes the action faster and less tedious. The other change, on the other hand, greatly pitches things in the player's favor. When you die, your ship gets upgraded. The 2 option-like claw satellites appear and cling to your ship once you die if you haven't collected them already, and triple your firepower. On top of that, any weapon you've collected in Kids mode becomes semi-permanent. You don't lose them until you continue, allowing you to make use of the full suite of game skills in a way only expert players can do otherwise. Besides this dramatic optional mechanical rebalancing, M2 has also implemented a few technical fixes that players can use at their discretion. The original version of the game pushed the Genesis hardware so vigorously that the action could occasionally wheeze to a crawl, a shortcoming which you can remove if you like, though certain moments of slowdown that were implemented for the sake of fairness and balance remain regardless. The original game also used voice samples to announce weapon pickups, but the Genesis sound chip couldn't play these clips simultaneously with the music. SEGA Ages includes the ability to prevent samples from interrupting the other audio, resulting in a subtly smoother experience. And for those with the wherewithal to complete the game once, beating Lightning Force will let you unlock the Styx fighter from Thunder Force 3. This isn't a feature M2 invented from scratch. According to them, it was carried over from a Japan-only Thunder Force collection for Sega Saturn. The hidden Styx feature that was added when Thunder Force 3 was ported over to Sega Saturn can now be used after completing the game, SEGA Ages team says. It gives a different dynamic to the gameplay and gives it replay value. The inclusion of a bonus Thunder Force 3 element also speaks to M2 and Sega's grand vision for the Ages series. The conversion of Technosoft's catalog, they tell me, won't be limited to Thunder Force 4. We are also planning on releasing multiple titles from Technosoft. Again, Thunder Force AC has already been confirmed for a future release, and it's not hard to imagine the likes of Herzog Zwei coming to Ages as a sort of spiritual counterpart for Gain Ground. To me, Lightening Force speaks to the potential of this new SEGA Ages line in a much more exciting way than the umpteenth port of Sonic the Hedgehog. Here we have a brilliant game converted faithfully, and optionally enhanced. A game that hasn't been published in the US in a quarter of a century. What's not to love about that? If this is what Sega and M2 have in store for Ages, I'm all in. Special thanks to Sega for providing both review code and additional information for this video. Next on SEGAiden, whatever comes out in October.